I think it illustrates the interest in the topic we're going to be talking about this afternoon, this morning. So good morning and thank you for joining us for the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's briefing on Bahrain, the second briefing we've done this year because conditions in Bahrain continue to worsen. I especially want to thank our panelists for their presence today and for their long-standing efforts to protect human rights and support democracy in Bahrain. At some point this fall, Bahrain will hold elections for the 40-seat Council of Representatives, one of two chambers of the National Assembly. The election is important because the Council is the only elected governing body in the country. So the election will be the only opportunity the people of Bahrain will have to choose some of their leaders. And choosing some leaders is important because Bahrain, a Shia majority country, is ruled by a hereditary Sunni monarchy. So what is the likelihood that these elections will be free and fair? Spoiler alert. Right now the answer is not very. Political parties are banned in Bahrain. Political societies operate as the functional equivalent. But the two most important of those, Al-Wafaq and Wad, have been dissolved by the government. Then 2 months ago in May, the National Assembly advanced legislation that essentially bans individual members of the political opposition from seeking election. So there are no parties, and key leaders won't be able to run as individuals either. That's on top of the fact that many key opposition leaders are in jail. Prominent figures like Nabil Rajab, Sheikh Ali Salman, Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja, Abdul Jalil Al-Singas, Ahmed Houmadeh, and Najib Fatil, and many others continue to be detained for exercising fundamental human rights like freedom of expression. These developments and others, like the closing of the only independent newspaper, Al-Wasat, in 2017, are worrisome and they are very frustrating. Worrisome because Bahrain continues to host the United States Fifth Fleet, and to my knowledge, there is no plan B in the works. Frustrating because a few short years back, Bahrain had a real chance to move in a more democratic direction by implementing the recommendations of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. Instead, the government has doubled down on its repression of opposition voices and essentially closed off all peaceful channels for the expression of dissent. Like other authoritarian governments around the world, the Bahraini government has carried out its crackdown in the name of fighting terrorism. Newsflash. With such tactics, Bahrain is more likely to feed extremism than to defeat it. So today we're going to hear recommendations for things Congress should do to encourage Bahrain to change course and ensure its upcoming elections will be free and fair. There is still time, and I hope the government there will listen. Otherwise, we can all foresee that opposition to the regime inside the country and out will only increase. So again, I thank everybody for being here. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Ken Katzman of the Congressional Research Service, who will introduce our panelists and moderate this discussion.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank the Commission for asking me to moderate this very important meeting to discuss the electoral process in Bahrain, with the next election due in the fall. Usually it's either late October or early November. They usually set the date pretty close to the time. This will be the second election for the Council of Representatives since the February 2011 uprising. And as is typically the case in Bahrain, the political climate gets progressively more tense as the election approaches. Since Bahrain returned to an electoral process in 2002, one of the most contentious elections was in the fall of 2010, which was on the eve of and certainly a factor in the 2011 uprising that occurred in the climate of the Arab Spring uprisings more generally. We have an excellent panel for you today to discuss this issue. Experts that focus and activists and advocates that focus generally on the Middle East, democracy in the Middle East, human rights in the Middle East, as well as specifically on Bahrain. And so I think it's most beneficial to turn it right over to the panel. We're going to have Les Campbell of National Democratic Institute speak first, followed by Michael Payne whose organization focuses specifically on Bahrain, and batting cleanup is Seth Binder at the Project on Middle East Democracy, which has done a lot of work on particularly what Congressman McGovern mentioned, the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry findings and recommendations, and the government's implementation or non-implementation of those recommendations. So let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the Lantos Human Rights Commission for convening this briefing on Bahrain's 2018 elections and for inviting me to participate. I'd also like to thank the Commission for consistently highlighting issues related to democracy, governance, and human rights in the Kingdom of Bahrain over these many years. It's been good to see so many briefings on the subject. Although my organization, the National Democratic Institute, or NDI, no longer provides advice or training to political societies, election officials, or NGOs in Bahrain, NDI did work with political activists, NGOs, and election and government officials prior to the elections in Bahrain in 2002, 2006, and 2010. We did some analysis of the 2014 elections as well. This work was supported at the time by the National Endowment for Democracy and the Middle East Partnership at the State Department, but we're no longer able to work in Bahrain. I'm going to offer a summary of previous elections, but I'll do it through the prism of electoral fairness and integrity. And at the end of my statement, I will offer some recommendations on improvements that could make the 2018 elections less discriminatory, more representative, and ultimately more successful. Because I'm going to cover a lot of territory and with limited time, I'm going to, in this verbal portion, kind of gloss over a lot of things. Forgive me in advance. I will submit the full version of this statement, so it'll be put up on the website, so you can look at that later on. So by necessity, I'm going to go through a lot of material quickly. So elections in Bahrain, and I'm going to start in 2002, sort of post the new constitution. In 2002, concerns about the king's intentions and his surprise announcement of the formation of an equal upper house, which would be equal to the elected lower house, led four political societies, the main political societies, Al Wafaq, Wa'ad, and the National Amal and Al Khawni, led the four main societies to boycott the October elections. Due in part to the Shiite party boycott, voter turnout in 2002 was about 50%, and Sunni parties or Sunni-oriented political societies won 2/3 of the 40 lower house seats. In November 2006, Bahrainis went to the polls again, but voter turnout this time was about 73% of the 295,000 eligible voters. Why was that? Because the boycotting parties had been convinced to re-engage. I would argue that in part was because the world was engaged in Bahrain in 2006. There were a number of programs supported by the U.S. as well as the British and others, NDI and other organizations, the American Bar Association, different groups were in there helping and assisting, providing advice. We supported in 2006 domestic election monitoring. We helped support the Bahrain Transparency Society, Bahrain Human Rights Organization, to do monitoring of the election, so people had a lot more faith in the election in 2006. 73% of people turned out, and the Al Wafaq, the political society, won 18 seats, less than a majority, but it was still 18 out of 40. It gave them a very powerful bloc, and Sunni independents won 17 seats at the time, or Al Wafaq won 18 seats. The summer prior to the 2010 elections saw increased pressure against opposition societies from the regime. I think I would argue that the period from 2006 to 2010 was maybe too successful from the government's perspective because the lower house had been quite active, so the government cracked down. They arrested 23 Shiite leaders, blocked funding associated with the opposition societies. In addition, the Shiite opposition accused the government of drawing electoral boundaries to favor Sunni candidates. Even with a fairly large disadvantage, with districts drawn in a disadvantaged way, and even with a lot of repression, Al Wafaq still managed to win 18 seats in the lower house. So again, not a majority, but they did quite well. Sunni Islamists won 5 seats, which was down from 15 previously, and Sunni independents won 17 seats. Voter participation in 2010 was estimated at about 67%, so it was a drop from 2006, but still relatively high. And then By the time of the 2014 elections, NDI and other organizations were no longer able to work in Bahrain. I'm actually going to take material from POMED at the time when they did a report on the 2014 elections. And according to POMED, then 6 candidates obtained an outright majority, so there were runoffs in 34 of the 40 districts. The runoffs were won primarily by Sunni independents, and ultimately 37 of the 40 seats went to Sunni independents. According to the government, 51% of registered voters turned out to vote, although the opposition political societies claimed the turnout was more like 30%, but even if it was 50, that was more than 20 points down from 2010. So the boycotts and the repression had a big impact on turnout in 2014, and it's quite clear that in 2014, the lower house, which even though the groups and people that should have won a majority didn't, the lower house in 2006 was at least somewhat representative of the population, but by 2010 it was no longer really representative at all of the population. And now 2014 I should say, sorry, and now we know where we are in Bahrain in 2018. Why is the election system, why is it unfair? How did it become unfair? What are the major aspects of it? As Representative McGovern mentioned, there aren't parties in Bahrain, there are political societies, and even they are under a lot of pressure. The Ministry of Justice can withhold licenses or dissolve organization if the political society doesn't abide by other provisions in the law. In 2014, the Ministry of Justice amended the law to require societies to seek advanced approval from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before communicating, meeting with foreign diplomatic or consular missions or representatives of foreign governments. Really, in effect, they have a ban on meeting anyone that is not approved ahead of time. Bahrain's law on political rights was amended in 2016 to prohibit religious figures from political participation. This is a big issue in Bahrain where many religious figures, it's a country full of religious figures actually, and a lot of them are in politics, especially within the Shia party, so that causes a big problem for the Shia-oriented societies. And in 2018, as was mentioned in the beginning of this meeting, the Shura Council approved another amendment to the law which barred the following people from running for office: people convicted of a prison sentence of 6 months or more, which is most political activists actually, leaders and members of dissolved political organizations, which basically is every Shia political society, and then whoever destroys or disrupts the conduct of constitutional parliamentary life by terminating or leaving parliamentary work. So in other words, a number of members left the council after repression, and so they can't run again. So in effect, these new restrictions ban almost all opposition political figures from electoral office. Electoral districts, very complicated issue in Bahrain, but I'll just go over it very, very quickly. By the 2010 parliamentary elections, an average Shia majority district represented 9,500 eligible voters, while the average Sunni majority district represented 6,196 voters. And even though Bahrain's population is estimated to comprise 60 to 70% Shia, the Shia votes always account for well fewer than 50% of the parliamentary seats. To be fair, in November 2014, the king announced a decree announcing demarcation of new parliamentary districts. While we don't know the methodology used to demarcate the new electoral districts or exactly how it was done, the Justice Ministry now claims that the districts are, that 90% of them are within some kind of reasonable mean size. And a report from Congressional Research Service notes that it's possible that the new demarcation could lead to a more fair outcome, but I think this is debatable, and NDI did some sample looking at the new demarcated areas and ran some simulations, and we're not sure, but anyway, there are new districts. So to conclude, what could be done? It's a pretty dire situation. It's clear that the playing field has been tilted dramatically in favor of the government. They've done it on purpose. It's happened over many years. It's been very systematic. They have marginalized any kind of opposition groups, including the peaceful opposition. I think the main Bahraini opposition, for example, Al-Wafaq, have proven themselves to be fundamentally a peaceful movement. They've been driven by politics, but what could be done? Things could be done before the 2018 elections. First, the Constitution and electoral law should recognize as a fundamental right genuine democratically elections. They should clearly define and detail the country's governmental structure and electoral system. Election districts, it's obvious that equal suffrage requires the weight of each person's vote to be essentially the same. Essentially is a broad issue. There are many experts in my full statement. I lay out some of the differences that are common around the world. So of course there will be differences in sizes, but you can draw the districts so that there's a sense of fairness. But in addition to the size of the districts, equal suffrage also requires that every citizen's vote have equal weight, irrespective of distinctions such as race, color, gender, language, religious, political, or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, and other status. So in other words, if the demarcation of electoral boundaries are drawn in such a way that divides minority communities and thus reduce their voting power, then they need to be looked at again. And the boundaries definitely dilute the minority communities. The election management body, and this is an issue that's been raised in Bahrain many times, should be impartial and competent and perceived to be as both. But the gold standard around the world, and now there are 7 countries in Middle East and North Africa that have independent election commissions. In 1998, the Arab world had only 1 independent election commission, and now has 7. It's a trend. Just for example, Jordan has one. Tunisia, there are a number of them. Iraq has an independent election commission. Bahrain should have an independent election commission that is properly funded, but does not take its orders directly from the government ministry. There should be in elections, number 4 recommendation, in election there should be free monitoring observation by parties, candidates, domestic non-partisan election monitors, the news media, and international election observers. The vast majority of elections in the Middle East and North Africa now are monitored by international observers as well as domestic election observers, and Bahrain should be no exception. There should be, of course, legal recognition and status of political parties, and the legal framework should be non-discriminatory and without undue restriction. And finally, voting. The legal framework must address all the issues to ensure a genuine opportunity to exercise the right to vote on the basis of equal and universal suffrage. Could it be done? Difficult, obviously, but if the will was there, all of these things which have these recommendations are made, which have been adopted by many countries in the region, could all be put in place by November 2018. Thanks.
Just before we move to Michael, let me just jump in for some context. Bahrain's National Assembly, it does have review powers. It has powers under the Congress. Just because the election is for this lower house of their assembly. The Bahrain National Assembly is not the U.S. Congress. They have some power. They do review legislation. They can draft legislation. It is not a co-equal branch of power with King Hamad. It is not the U.S. Congress. So we're talking about Bahrain's National Assembly. It's not nothing. It's not a rubber stamp, but just to put that in perspective. Michael?
Thank you. As Leslie also said, my full remarks will be on submitted to the Commission for the record as well. After thousands of Bahrainis protested the government's failure to implement promised democratic reforms in February 2011, security forces violently crushed the demonstrations and retaliated against nearly every opposition group. Authorities temporarily closed WAD and imprisoned its Secretary General, arrested and tortured Al-Wafaq MPs, disbanded Amal, and jailed the leaders of Haq and Al-Wafa for life. That May, former President Obama said that, quote, mass arrests and brute force are at odds with the universal rights of Bahrain's citizens, and such steps will not make legitimate calls for reform go away. The only way forward is for the government and opposition to engage in dialogue, and you can't have a real dialogue when parts of the peaceful opposition are in jail. More than 7 years later, Bahrain has not just jailed the opposition, it's dismantled it entirely. Ahead of the parliamentary election set for this fall, the government has closed virtually all political space for peaceful political dissent, and the U.S. has greenlit repression with new unconditional arms sales. In July 2016, the authorities arbitrarily dissolved Al-Wafaq, the country's largest opposition political society, with courts rejecting all subsequent appeals in 2017 and 2018. Security officials shut down the society's website, closed its headquarters, and seized its assets. The public prosecution is even seeking a death penalty against its imprisoned leader, Sheikh Ali Salman. In May 2017, the authorities took similar measures to close WAD, a secular cross-sectarian leftist society, and its first appeal was rejected that October. The small Al-Wahdawi Society is the only legal opposition group still operating in Bahrain and has also faced mounting pressure. In 2015, the then Secretary General was imprisoned for tweets, and authorities have repeatedly interrogated its current leader over inciting protests on social media. This past spring, the government issued new legislation banning members of the dissolved societies from ever again running for election, stripping thousands of Bahrainis of their political rights. The scale of repression is earning increased criticism from the international community. In June 2017, 5 UN human rights experts condemned the government's closure of Al-Wafaq and WAD and its unacceptable restrictions on basic freedoms. Likewise, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has repeatedly called on Bahrain to curb its repression. In his opening statement to the UN Human Rights Council just last month, he urged Bahrain to reverse, quote, profoundly damaging trends and continued crackdowns on civil society and additional legislation that further restricts the people's fundamental rights. Almost simultaneously, the European Parliament adopted a new resolution explicitly denouncing Bahrain's attacks on opposition activists and calling for new restrictions on European security assistance to the kingdom. The UN Human Rights Committee is currently reviewing Bahrain's adherence to its treaty obligations under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, and while the outcome is forthcoming, the kingdom has received intense scrutiny from the committee's independent human rights experts. Here in the US, however, the Trump administration has taken nearly no steps to encourage democratic reform in Bahrain. Months after his inauguration, the president told Bahrain's king that there would be no strain in the relationship, signaling that Obama-era human rights conditions would be dropped from existing F-16 sales. 2 days after their meeting, the king approved a lethal police raid on a peaceful sit-in. 5 demonstrators were killed and hundreds injured. A month later, the king amended the constitution to allow military courts to try civilians, and the ensuing proceedings were immediately marked by allegations of torture, enforced disappearance, and other due process violations. The Trump administration was undeterred, and it has since authorized even more unconditional arms sales, including attack helicopters and bombs that will likely contribute to the ongoing catastrophe in Yemen, where Bahrain's military is deployed. The administration says it has maintained restrictions on new arms sales to Bahrain's Ministry of Interior Police due to their direct role in repressing and suppressing human rights, but the State Department actually appears to have boosted overall engagement with the MOI. State has continued NADR-ATA funding for MOI units like the notorious riot police and has now proposed a 10-point training program for police through 2019, despite the MOI's past failure to pass Leahy law vetting due to ongoing gross violations of human rights. To top it all off, the administration has even proposed transferring another frigate according to the NDAA language, and an unmistakable sign of American support for the kingdom's worsening abuses. The elections are an opportunity for Bahrain to demonstrate a real commitment to reconciliation, laying the groundwork for sustainable political development and stability, and this is clearly an American interest. But if the elections were held tomorrow, they would make a mockery of the democratic process, and the US would be firmly entrenched on the wrong side of history. At this juncture,